So, welcome back from the break, and we're going to talk about our next topic, which is budgeting. And we're going to look at revenue and expenses. And remember, our textbook, your textbook is going to come in really handy. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 are the chapters that you're reviewing. We went over Chapter 1, and we're going through Chapter 2 and 3 today. So, today we're going to specifically look at the tuition and fees, including trends in tuition pricing. It has increased dramatically. And the impact of tuition on access and affordability. We're also going to look at various government grants available to colleges and universities, especially public universities. Ours is private, so we do qualify for some things, but not as a public institution. So federal, state, and local funding, as well as gifts and endowments, etc. And you're going to learn about philanthropy, fundraising, and the whole role of development offices that you see in a lot of very successful universities. They have machines of people looking at tuition, so in our case admission, right? And then we have funding that is coming in from outside sources, and also fundraisers to get funding not only from the state or the government, but you also have private donors and also alumni who are very successful donating to the university. So once again, the overview of higher education organization finance. Those of you with some finance background, the higher education finance is very specific because we want to, like other organizations, we are focused on vision, mission, as well as the strategic plan of the organization. But our main goal is for sure to make sure that we are educating our students. It's going to be very important to have people who are qualified. There needs to be policies in each level and also regulations that are easy to understand. We also need to have budget planning where how much is coming in revenue and how much is going out. And then lastly, when we look at budgeting, we're also looking at financial strategies and planning as well. How does it align with the bigger picture to survive, especially in our unexpected and unprecedented event like the pandemic? A lot of the smaller universities have closed, and some of the bigger universities as well has let go of some of their faculty members as well. It doesn't matter if they're tenured or non-tenured. If the program doesn't exist, there's no budget to have personnel. So I went over this in the other lectures, but terminologies in higher education, for instance, what you need to be looking at, of course, is the budget planning and financial planning. First, we're going to look at budget planning. So what's coming in and what's going out. The financial planning is going to be more long-term that we're going to talk about, especially for your final project. As you develop your program, what you should be constantly asking yourself is how much needs to come in and how much is, essential. There's operation costs that you need to be thinking about, but also investments. A lot of the universities have some capital gains, they have real estate, etc. We talked about how UIW is sitting in a location that is gold mine in a lot of ways because Alamo Heights area is very expensive real estate in San Antonio. And then today we're going to be specifically looking at revenue and expenses. So those of you who want to go back to your textbook, it's chapter 2, and also we're going to be looking at chapter 3 today. And what is budget in higher education? Well, it's easy to understand, but because it's too easy to understand, sometimes it gets a little daunting. some of the types of budgets in higher education is operations. A lot of the funding goes into operation. So what you see visibly are faculty members and probably staff members and advisors, but there's also support staff. If we have buildings, we need people who are cleaning, right? Janitors. There's also technicians for various different things. So the operations are going to be very important. We also have the capital, we have special funds, as well as auxiliary funds, that there are different types of budgets in higher education. So these are areas that we should be looking at in terms of not only, like I said, the professors, but there are other operation features that we're not really looking at. So how do we reconcile with, operations, special funds, capital, etc.? We want to make sure that a lot of the universities, for instance, University of Incarnate Word, like I said, the finances are not publicly accessible. I put it in the chat, the iPads that one of your colleagues mentioned a couple of weeks ago. It's a really good resource. And a lot of the public universities, for example, UTSA has salaries of all faculty members full time, as well as their budget, because they're getting funding from the state as well as federal. So they have mandatory reporting where they have to disclose that information. UIW does not. So what you can do, since UIW's budget information is not available, you can look at the UTSA, because it does have Department of Education, and kind of look at their budget to get a ballpark of what they're running on. Of course, the tuition rates are a lot lower than UIW, but you still get a sense of cost of living. Because if you're looking at budgets from California or New York or DC area, for instance, the cost of living is a lot higher in those areas. So it's going to be apples to oranges. So when you look at the types of budgets that you're seeing, you want to look at specifically this area, the common budget models in higher education. Where are they? If you look at your chapter on page 75, if you go to 75, these are the common budget models in higher education. So I don't want you to be furiously writing, because it's all the information that is in your textbook this time around. So here are the common budget models, and the diagram that is really great to look at. I know the writing is a little bit small because I wanted to get all the information for you there. Is if you go to page, let me see, it's table 3.4, it's page 86 in your text, and it has a nice table. Let me see if I'm able to share this. Let me get my camera down and see, because I can't take the snapshots of this because of the copyright issue. So let me see if you can see my video. Oh, it's not allowing me to. Let me stop sharing. And what you can do is, can you see the textbook? Okay, so it looks like this. So what I'm going through is, let me see if I can make it bigger. Okay, so it's this in your textbook, and that's what I'm going over right now. I know, as I'm getting older, the little prints are not. So that's what we're going over. And this is a really good example of APA 7th edition table. So I wanted to show you. So this is in your textbook. So and I'm going through each of the models, so you don't have to furiously be writing at this moment. So let me see if I can continue to share my other PowerPoint at this point. So this will be that kind of thing. I heard something in the background, so let me
I'm
see.
sorry. Am I missing something, or like all for Dr. Love? All I see is like some paper in front of your lap. Am I?
No, I'm getting my PowerPoint back up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I'm like,
so
what did I miss?
I know you're like, what happened?
Last
You're
week I
looking
was
at,
seeing noodles, and this week I'm seeing papers. I'm like, wow.
yes. And my daughter was like laughing in the background because she thought she was so funny. So let me get back to the, and then let me get back to my, okay, I'm back. And so, yes, you're looking at papers. So that is your textbook just in case. And so I wanted to just make sure that I showed it to you. And what we're looking at is common budget. So we're first going through all funds. So all funds is, it highlights the holistic goal-oriented perspective. So we're looking at all sources of revenue and expenses. This means that the person, usually the budgetary manager, has purview of all the budgets at the university. So it's more of a centralized model as opposed to decentralized model that you see. It facilitates resources from all allocation for the institutional goals. So the limitation, of course, is that if you're not visible in an institution, right? And if you don't have well documented accounting procedures, so for example, let's say you spend 20 hours on administrative things, but there's no documentation over the 5 years, the money is not going to go to that department or the school. So the allocation in this case, it's holistic, meaning who's bringing in the revenue, who's bringing the expenses, what's value added, right? And value put in. Because like I said, at the end of the day, we want to hit the black or, right? Or hit the zero where there's no losses or no gains. The black is better where you have the plus side. So all funds is a model where you have a holistic view, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily the best budget procedure if, for example, at UIW, there's 11 schools, and what's on the news right now are mostly what the medical school and a lot of the health professional schools. When do you see news of School of Education? When was the last time that you've seen School of Education? So that's what we're talking about. Formula. This is those of you who have spots for everything. So this is more formula. It's used for specific criteria. So it's not all or none or the holistic, but each program has different formulas in terms of, biology, you may need more student fees, or chemistry because there's a lab, or for medical school, for instance, they're using cadavers. Development of formula is very critically important, so it needs to be evidence-based. It is also retrospective in nature. So if you have a new program, you don't have the baseline. Remember the Excel sheet that I sent you? If you have that, and of course that's not what you're going to be doing for assignment 2. For your final project, I just want to give you a preview, is you need to have historical data to come up with a formula that works for your student population. And it is very, very popular in higher education because it is equitable, because each department needs different things. And hopefully the strength is transparency, it's efficient, it links to different states. So if there's a policy, for example, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, for instance, and the psychology department already has a program, for instance, or religious studies, or etc., it may be equitable, or it may be more economical and efficient to use that resource and then use that formula. It tends to privilege a larger and more selective institution because they have more data, and institutions that are older are able to benefit from this formula, because formula, as you know, those of you who like math and quantitative, the mean is very fickle if you have outliers. So for example, if we're looking at data from COVID, for example, it'll shift the formula. You have to take some of these outliers outside the formula. So if you don't have a historical data that is long, if the program only started 5 years ago, and then 3 of the years is COVID, you're not going to have a reliable formula. So that is a downfall. Performance-based. This is very, very popular in industry, where allocation of resources is, it relies on attainment of performance measures. So the metric could be, for instance, getting more students, more graduation rate, retention, etc. And it does have transparency because we know what you need to hit. Like, for example, when you go into some of the stores, they tell you like 10 new customers came in by this, salesperson, and this person is going to get the bonus, as opposed to, no one else. So it links also the state of priority, meaning if there's a push to get more students into the university and one department or one school is doing better, they're actually going to get more funding. It does have value embedded in these approaches, but also it puts people in programs that are not popular, for instance. So let's say, for instance, women's study was not that popular. That program is going to suffer, although the numbers have been pretty steady. Because they didn't hit this 10% increase, they may not get any funding. So as you see in the chart, there's some political component to it. So a lot of the universities use a combination of some of the budget strategies or budget models. There's another one called incremental, which established across the board in terms of percentages of expenses over the current budget for the upcoming year. So it is very common for higher education. So for example, universities have different lines of faculty. Each school, 11 schools may have allocation of like 2 faculty members per year, but it also gives, the strength is equal treatment for the units, and also reduces some of the personal conflicts because everyone's getting equal amount, easy to access. It's scalable, meaning that we're able to give 1 or 2 depending on the need. But unfortunately, some of the limitations is inequities, is the ones who are increasing percentage wise. So if you think about numbers, if you're increasing incrementally better, like if you have, for example, if you started with 10 and then if you get 15, you actually have what? A 50% increase in terms of the enrollment. However, if you have 100 students and only 2 people came in, right, the percentages are a lot lower. And so reliance on the current budget can serve to obscure some poor allocations depending on the kind of math that you're using and what kind of formula as well. There's initiative based. So a lot of times there's a lot of initiative these days for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So there's some state funding, federal funding to have these initiative. It's only sometimes one-time thing, or it could be ongoing, but a lot of the times government funding always runs out. So you apply to the pool of money, and one of the strength, of course, is it allows the programs to apply. And then when you apply, you're doing self-evaluation studies on the programs and able to kind of reassess what you're doing. It focuses on what some of the priorities would be. And then, but at the same time, it also is the redistribution. So depending on what the initiative is, some of so let's say if one of the major initiative was vaccine, right? Vaccine drive for COVID, but the but there's limited funding, for instance, and we're still in the pandemic and we still have to give out vaccine, that initiative may die out just because there's not enough funding. So it may compete with some of the priorities depending on what's initiated, who's in the government, what policy, etc. And it allows for more competition because instead of an abundance mindset, it really gives more of the scarcity mindset because there's a limited funding and everyone's jumping on it as well. So those are some of the models. And if you go to the next page, there's planning, programming, and budgeting system, where those of you who are in program evaluation track, for instance, it ties in well with the strategic planning. You're doing continual improvement and also taking information and also doing program evaluation from the beginning, middle to the end. The decision, it depends on the challenges and opportunities. You have to look at more of the risk benefit ratio. And the strength is you're able to kind of address the emerging challenges and opportunities because you're very agile. Because I know some of you are in companies where you have meetings almost every day for like 5-10 minutes to see the state of what your company is doing. Like I believe it's agile. I forgot. There's a lot of different meeting techniques to just make sure that you are able to pivot. It's time consuming because, like I said, a lot of people don't keep track of their progress. You really need someone to make sure that variables are precisely measured, and it assumes period of stability. So if there's a lot of ups and downs, for instance, the program evaluation during COVID, like I said, is not a really good indicator of what is to come next time around when it's not during the pandemic. The last two, the responsibility center, for example, it's more of a decentralized model where the budget is happening at local levels. The cost, I think some of you have mentioned where some units are seen as revenue or cost centers, right? Which is a really great observation. I think our brain automatically puts a label, whether or not we actually verbalize it, but we kind of need to categorize things. And those of you who keep a neat home, you're able to find things more quickly and efficiently. And same thing for the responsibility centers. It is able to kind of label different components in different parts of the university, and you're able to kind of see which centers could be retained, which centers cannot be retained. And some of the strength is that you're quickly able to see the performance of each of the centers because we know this is a revenue generating, this is an expense, and encourages more of the entrepreneurship because we know that there's a cost and benefit to everything that we're doing, as opposed to some of these other models where it's not as white or black in terms of cost or revenue. It also provides incentives for strong budget management. So if you have a really good budget manager, they are able to run the revenue center and expense center very well to make sure that you never actually go in the black. In the red. Unfortunately, when you start labeling different centers, it causes stratifications or different, labels for different groups that it can foster more competitiveness and also decisiveness. And also there's academic capitalism, meaning those who perform better and also can create more profit will survive, as opposed to, centers who are really essential, although they're expense centers, but they are really important to the operation of the whole university. And then lastly, zero base is easy to understand. All budgets have to be zero, meaning we need to make sure that every time we're balancing the budget, we're either up or down, we're right in the middle. It works wonderfully, like in academia, in theory, but in reality, because of the economy and also the stock market, it usually does not really happen. So a lot of times we're going to see a hybrid format of these models come into play. And also it takes a lot of notation. So if you have any friends who are CPAs, for example, or accountant, they know this process because you have to count every single penny to make sure that you hit the zero, because every penny counts to hit that zero mark. And then it also causes a lot of angst and also dissatisfaction because, like I said, life is so fickle that it'll be really hard to hit a zero all the time. So those are some of the models that you see in your book. And if it's hard to see, I put it on here where from your book, all funds, formula, performance-based, incremental budgeting, initiative-based budgeting, responsibility, program, and zero-based. And what you want to kind of look at is look at the chapter. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, in other literature, you may hear something like activity-based, meaning sometimes it's looking at some of the activities that they're initiating based on budgeting. That might be, so for example, if you're tier one, NCAA, for example, they may be putting more funding on the players and also making sure that they're academically well off to make sure they qualify for some of these competitions, for example. There's also other schools kind of look at zero base. You're wondering, is there a school that actually does zero base? I said theoretically it's impossible, but if you want to know, one of the university that uses zero base budgeting that I found out is, I believe it's Georgia State actually uses zero base budgeting from what I've read so far. And then one of the, let's see, the resource based or the responsibility center, for example, Pepperdine University uses that. A lot of the activity or initiative based, University of Texas at Austin also uses that model. And then also, let's see if it's looking at some of these all funds and formula, you'll notice that different universities will have different strategies, and a lot of times they're going to use a hybrid format. They'll take not just one model, but different combinations of models to balance their budget. So revenue, what's coming in is going to be really important, and this should be easy to kind of look at. So some of the revenue, this is in chapter 2, is the revenue based in higher education are as follows: enrollment driven budgeting. So the revenue is really heavily based on enrollment. There's endowment driven budgeting where you have a lot of people donating to the university. So the enrollment driven budgeting, for example, I think one of the states that uses the enrollment budget driving revenue is University of Michigan uses this model for revenue generating. The endowment, you could probably guess. I know some of you have looked at this university. Harvard University uses the endowment driven budgeting. A lot of times they get support and resources from alumni as well as big organizations and connections. The research driven budgeting, this is budgeting based on how much money that the faculty members are able to bring to the university. So for instance, some of these universities, 60% of the salary needs to be covered by the faculty member, meaning they have to bring in grants. The university will match 40%, and the faculty member has to come up with the 60% of their salary from grant money. And what university uses this revenue? MIT. So as you know, MIT brings in a lot of fantastic grant money for their cutting edge research, and it's a motivator. Not only is it prestigious, but also they're able to bring in money for that. And then lastly, fundraising driven budgeting. This is based on getting revenue from fundraising from small scale to big scale. So a philanthropy from different persons and organization. And let me see which university. All universities use fundraising driven budgeting, but the one that uses this to its advantage is Stanford University. They get so much money from the area, the Silicon Valley area, for instance, that they're able to create a lot of programs using some of this fundraising driven strategies. So these are some of the fundraising revenue, or the input from, besides tuition, for example, is in higher education. So in your textbook, what do they talk about? So I want to give you a model of some of the strategies: the tuition, the endowment, fundraising, and then they get research money. But the revenues that you get from higher education is state appropriated funds. Tuition is a big factor. Mandatory tuition fees, special student fees, endowment income. There's gifts, there's grants and contract, auxiliary services, special program, contracted institutional services, hospitals, if we have one, right? Patents, and also loyalties. So a lot of the inventions, for example, that is happening in a lot of these prestigious universities, they have patents for various different things, and they're getting royalties from people using it. Support from religious university and other income. So capital gains from buildings that they're, renting out, for example. So they're getting income from all these sources. So getting back to this revenue in higher education, like I said, enrollment driven, endowment driven, there's research driven and fundraising driven budgeting are some of the ways to kind of focus on how to generate funding. Some people do, some universities do combinations of all, but like I said, I gave you some examples of enrollment driven budgeting, University of Michigan, endowment, Harvard does a really great job, research, MIT. There are other institutions in research, usually in tier 1, and then fundraising, Stanford does it really well. So if you want to look at those examples, you can take a look. So expenses, so what goes in must go out, right? So what are some of the expenses in higher education? So big portion of the expenses is salary, not only faculty, but administrative staff, also support staff, right? Not only admin, but like I said, janitors, people who are doing other things, janitors, carpenters, some of the things that you don't think about, because in academia, we only think about researchers, admin stuff, etc., but we need everything. Benefits. So when you get salaries, you also have to give benefits, especially full-time workers. Program supplies. So depending on what program it is and what school, the program supply is going to differ. Office supplies. Because of COVID, we are not in offices, so people are pretty happy about not using. That's one of the expenses that people complain about. Ink for your printer, internet access, pens and pencils, paper, all these things that we think about, it all adds to cost. Computer equipment. Not only do you have to buy the computer, but you also have to upgrade them. Communication. So not only do we communicate via internet, phone, right? There's also mobile phones. I don't know if you remember beepers and all that stuff. If you have hospitals, etc., you have to be on call for 24 hours and the beeper goes off. So now you have, mobile phones and mobile services for people on call, for instance, publications and printing. And so you figured in academia, you actually have to pay to publish your work at many of the venues. So publication is not free. And also any kind of publications for posters and things that you're doing also is money. Postage, although we don't send out a lot of mail, still postage to think about. Programming, meaning if you have different events, you need to make sure that you have food, you have, various different things for programming either an event or etc. Professional development. Your staff cannot be stagnant. They have to be up to date, right? So you need to have funding for program evaluation and program development, memberships, and also fees to journals. Nothing is free. So depending on which journals that we subscribe to, you have to pay an annual fee. Travel. A lot of you will be traveling to different conferences for presentation. That is not free. You have to also allocate some funding for that. And then there's entertainment and gifts. So there may be holiday gifts or something for the expenses, facilities, remember heat, air conditioning, water, whatever. There's a lot of funding, taxes for property, etc., utilities, and then contracted services, debt services as well, because some of the buildings are not all paid off. So you also have to look at debt, scholarships and fellowships. So when you give out fellowships and scholarships, it's expenses, it's funding that you're giving out to the students. So these are some of the things that we are talking about in terms of expenses. And a lot of times it's hard to remember, all these things that go into running a business. But those of you who have a, business, that all these little things all add up. And these are things that you also have to take into consideration in higher education as well. So this is in chapter 2. It starts with revenue, and then it starts with expenses. So I'm going to just